Welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka from our studios here in London. Over the next half an hour, we'll be looking beyond the business headlines by giving you in-depth perspective on the stories that are affecting all of us. Coming up on today's show, the reignited battle with the EU, a shrinking economy and long-standing allegations about misconduct at the heart of Downing Street are just a few of the significant issues facing Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Our business correspondent Simon Pusey and the former British Minister of State for Europe and Climate to the Federal Foreign Office of Germany, Dennis McShane, will be joining me in the studio for their take on the state of British politics. And last week's election of dozens of British Nigerians into UK councils is seen as further evidence of the importance of the Nigerian diaspora. I discussed this and more with John Taylor, the Lord Taylor of Warwick, during a sit-down interview. Then later, Yinka Adewale, the CEO of Fintech firm Nomba, will be joining me from Lagos to tell me why the recent scrutiny of the sector will not hamper the industry's monumental rise. But first, let's have a look at the topic that's still dominating headlines here in the UK, the cost of living crisis. Yesterday, according to data released by the Office for National Statistics, the UK economy shrank by 0.1% last month. The soaring living costs and the war in Ukraine has hindered recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. Retail and wholesale activity fell by 2.3%, with the sale and maintenance of vehicles crashing by more than 15% amid global supply chain chaos. Consumers are holding back from spending due to rising inflation, which is currently at a 3-decade high. Opposition parties are asking for the government to do more to help struggling households.
We will do things to help people in the short term, of course, and I'm not going to anticipate anything more that we may do. But the crucial thing is to make sure that we have the strong employment situation, because that is the key thing.
Earlier, I spoke with our business correspondent Simon Pusey for some analysis. Simon, not my words, but the words of one political pundit were dull and uninspiring. I'm not sure if that was the Prince of Wales's delivery, but certainly the Queen's speech and the reopening of Parliament didn't ignite the public as it has in previous years.
Yeah, so this is basically what the government plans to do over the next 12 months. It's 38 new laws that ministers intend to pass in that time. The main story here really was that Prince Charles was delivering the Queen's speech and not the Queen, and that's because she has mobility issues at the moment and she's resting. And as you said, a lot of people saying that his delivery was fairly dull. It's quite a hard balance that he needs to put across, because obviously these are not his policies and he doesn't want to be endorsing them really. He's really just coming across as a neutral perspective, and that's what the Queen does as well. But it basically forms the start of the opening of Parliament, which marks the start of a new parliamentary year. There's a lot of pomp and circumstance and a lot of tradition in there.
That's what we
Black
love.
Rod and a lot of, exactly, very English, and lots of, music and trumpets. But the main new laws that were announced really are levelling up and regeneration bill. This is what the government talk about a lot to try and keep northern voters happy, talking about moving things out of London and putting them into the up north and putting them into different.
Is it ever going to happen?
Well, I mean, we've got a levelling up minister, of course, Michael Gove, who's been in the press for other reasons. But, they're talking a lot about this. I think a lot of it's rhetoric, but they are trying, I think, in various ways. The online safety bill, that's a mammoth piece of legislation to deliver government pledge to better regulate content, especially for younger people, and a public order bill, which will introduce new police powers over disruptive protests. This has caused a lot of drama, really, in terms of, noise levels. And we've seen a lot of protests after the last year, especially to do with climate and people disrupting roads around London and the UK. The omission of measures to improve workers' rights was something that a lot of people picked up on and said, ordinary working people are struggling enough at the moment, and that's what Sir Keir Starmer really picked up on as well in the Labour Party, saying that there was very little in terms of the cost of living crisis, which is something they've been banging a drum about over the last few weeks. Inflation currently 7% and rising, household bills going up by hundreds of pounds for ordinary people, and wages not matching that. And I think, the opposition parties were saying, well, you've got the massive chance here to do something about this, and you haven't done anything really. There was, 38 new laws, and some of them very worthy, but the main point here seems to be the cost of living crisis and people really struggling to pay their bills.
Why are they not doing anything?
It's hard to say, really. Boris Johnson still seems to be sticking to this thing of not putting a windfall tax on gas and energy firms. Whether that will continue, because there does seem to be a lot of pressure on him and the Conservative Party to do something about it. Him and Rishi Sunak have been saying that over the next few days they are going to make some announcements, but it's hard to know what, and it looks like they're kind of chasing their tails a little bit in terms of being able to catch up with this, and maybe they should have got a head start on it and announced something a little bit earlier. Mr. Johnson saying, our great compassion and ingenuity, we cannot simply spend our way out of the problem. So he's kind of pointing to Labour, as so often the Conservatives do, as not being trusted with the economy. They're going to put us in huge debt, which of course we already are. So yeah, I think it was a pretty bland Queen's speech. The main headline again is Prince Charles delivering it and not the Queen, and so a lot of eyes were on him, and you had Prince William sitting next to him, obviously taking notes for when it's his turn. But yeah, there's a lot of pomp around this, and I think a lot of countries look at it with a fairly sort of, this is ludicrous kind of eye, because you've got Black Rod and various traditions, and Boris and Sir Keir walking together in an awkward thing where they always share a joke. But the main thing I think is, opposition parties and critics will say, why has there not been any legislation specifically on trying to tackle the cost of living?
Yes, well, thank you, Simon. Talk again next week. Let's stay with this conversation about the UK's turbulent economic and constitutional issues. Earlier, I was joined by the former British Minister of State for Europe, Denis McShane. Denis McShane, it's always a pleasure having you on Channel's Business Global. I know I enjoy speaking to you, and I know our viewers enjoy learning from you. Firstly, I've got to have your thoughts on the Queen's speech. Most notably, Her Majesty was absent. I want your thoughts on that. And, of course, the lack of support for families. I know we weren't expecting that within the 38 bills, but certainly this is a crisis, and it doesn't appear as if the government have got a hold of it.
I think that's right. You could see that almost with poor Prince Charles, who had to read it out in place of his mother. And we're definitely, I think, in Britain moving into not a crisis, but into quite a turbulent period for the Constitution with the head of state. What happens? How long does the Queen stay there? Should she, like Pope Benedict, perhaps step back properly? Should Charles take over? But he's also not a young man and has got a lot of eccentric views. There's a younger Prince William with a nice young family. Perhaps we should skip a generation. Good. Let's go to the Queen's speech. 38 bills. There's hardly anyone that's been greeted warmly by even the Conservative supporting press. It's as if the government's just run out of ideas. It's Brexit, but it's not going well. It's seeing inflation taking off, doesn't know what to do. It's involved partly in the war in Europe with Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And again, it makes a lot of noises, but doesn't quite know what to do. And suddenly we're seeing what we always knew. The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has many great abilities, but in essence, he's a journalist. Give him a story to write each day and he produces, brilliant words.
Great slogans and
great
headlines.
Slogans, great words, makes us sit up and think.
We need more than that now, don't we?
But I think being Prime Minister of a complicated country like the United Kingdom, he's going into a full-scale argument with the EU about Northern Ireland. We could be seeing Scotland, maybe even Northern Ireland, leaving the UK. It's just, I've never seen so many different problems on a Prime Minister's desk in my lifetime.
Absolutely. And no new fine, though, according to reports this morning. So, Office for National Statistics says UK GDP fell back 0.1% in March. An economic think tank said 1.5 million households could go into poverty by the end of this year. The Bank of England forecast a recession. Are we going to see a U-turn from the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, who, by the way, did look like a wounded puppy, actually, I thought, at times on Tuesday after the Queen's speech during the debate, because, of course, he was met with a barrage of criticism. The government can do more. Why are they not doing more?
They've spent all of this century, well, that's only 22 years so far, locked in an ideology which says governments don't have to do anything. It just has to be the people must pull themselves up by their own efforts, by the bootstraps.
The Conservative way, yeah.
Yes, a right-wing way, but there are plenty of Conservative governments in Europe that realise you have to have a more balanced approach. And this government doesn't really believe in that. It's had 10 years of very, very substantial cut. So, for example, we now have huge waiting lists in our hospitals, didn't exist in 2010. We have 20, 30,000 fewer police officers on the streets, didn't exist 10 years ago. So people are nervous and uncertain. And then the government seems to pick the oddest and most unnecessary of fights with Washington on the so-called Northern Ireland Protocol with the European Union right across the board. So
with Putin.
Oh, no, I don't think it's picked up. Oddly enough, no. Mr. Johnson, rightly, in my view, is being very, very strong in words against Putin. But don't forget, when he was mayor of London, Boris Johnson created Londongrad. He said to the Russians, the oligarchs, come in, we want you. You can take over Mayfair, take over Kensington.
And they did.
And they did. And they gave money to the Conservative Party, and he put the son of a KGB agent into the House of Lords. Now, to be fair, when Putin went bonkers and invaded Ukraine, Boris Johnson dropped all of that. That's great. But I think a lot of his anti-Putin rhetoric is to try and get people to forget that for the last 10, 15 years, he and the Conservative Party, have, along with Marine Le Pen and a few others in Europe, have been Putin's best friends.
They've been flirting with them, haven't they? You've touched on Brexit quite a bit. It's been, front and centre of the headlines, squeezed in between the cost of living and Her Majesty's health over the past few days. Liz Truss has been speaking to her EU counterpart. The EU are not budging. But then we are starting to see the effects, aren't we? Look at the result of the local elections and Sinn Féin's dominance in local councils. Do you think that we could potentially start seeing the breakup of the United Kingdom? Far-fetched, but some political pundits are suggesting that.
Well, you've got it in spades in Scotland. Again, last Thursday, it was Mrs Sturgeon and the SNP that won big in Scotland. OK, it's only for local councils. She won big at the last general election. And the people of Scotland still aren't prepared to be told by Southern English they can't go and work and live in Europe. And that every decision that's taken in the Highlands or in Glasgow, where I was born, for example, I may not have a Scottish accent, but I spent the first 6 months of my life up there, has to be decided by elite Englishmen in London. And again, the rest of the world does have a more devolved approach. I mean, the way Bavaria is run is completely different from the way Hamburg is run. And it works, just as the way Florida is run is completely different from the way Vermont is run. And that's the modern economy. Here, everything, a tiny number of super elite boys, and they tend all to be gentlemen, in London decide everything. Scotland said no. But Mr Johnson doesn't know how to change his own personal ideology and approach to these problems, I think. So yes, I think we're going into what will be the most turbulent decade in British history, possibly for 100 years.
God, that's a gloomy forecast. I know you spent a lot of time really experienced in Europe. Do you think the EU will back down in its sentiment on the protocol at all? Or do you think we are triggering another few years of tension when we appear to be coming together over Russia?
Forget the EU. There's a big bunch of MPs, British MPs, on Capitol Hill in Washington a few weeks ago, and they met with the most senior congressional leaders, Rich Neal, the chairman of Ways and Means, Nancy Pelosi, we've all heard of, the Speaker of the House. And they said, if you do anything to the treaty with the EU that then threatens the Good Friday Agreement, and it will, because what the DUP want, what the ultra-hardliners want, is to restore a border in Northern Ireland. That then will automatically produce violence, and the United States will come down like a ton of bricks on any British Prime Minister who does that, as will the rest of Europe. So this is Boris Johnson at a time when America and Europe as a whole are uniting, thank goodness, to take on Putin, and he wants to launch his own little war on behalf of a small party in Northern Ireland that was comprehensively rejected in the polls last Thursday.
Wonderful insights. Dennis McShane, thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global today. Thank you.
Great pleasure. Thanks, Julia.
Coming up on Channel's Business Global, John Taylor, the Lord Taylor of Warwick, speaks to me about the importance of harnessing the economic opportunities between the UK and the Nigerian diaspora. And Nigeria's fintech sector may have faced criticism over the past few weeks, but according to Yinka Adewale, the CEO of Nomba, this won't stop the industry's monumental rise. All this after the break. Welcome back to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka from our studios here in London. Now, the United Kingdom enjoys a multitude of relationships with Nigeria, most especially through the hundreds of thousands living here in the UK that still conduct successful business between both countries. Last week, scores of British Nigerians were elected to represent their local areas in large parts of the UK. Recently, the British government announced that it aims to be more proactive in initiating programmes that build the capacity of Nigeria as an emerging science and technology hub in Africa. And John Taylor, the Lord Taylor of Warwick, spoke to us about his involvement in boosting this partnership.
It's a pleasure and a privilege to host the UK-Nigeria Trade Summit at the House of Lords. I think it's perhaps the first time that Nigerian music had ever been played at the House of Lords since the House of Lords started in the 14th century. So that was a first. No, the event was a great success. There were government ministers, both Nigerian and British. There were ambassadors, MPs, peers, and even Nigerian royalty. For 40 years, Britain was focused very much on the European Union. And I think to the neglect of the Commonwealth, in my opinion. Now that Brexit is a fact, not a fantasy, we can now trade more with the rest of the world, including the Commonwealth. And of course, Nigeria is a leading nation in the Commonwealth. The other factor is there are at least 200,000 Nigerians living in Britain. So the Nigerian diaspora is a significant force in Britain and can help this process. And at long last, the government, I think, is waking up to the potential. After all, you know, the UK and Nigeria already trade with each other, and it's £3.2 billion worth of trade. Significant. So we want to build upon that historical success. We also have a lot in common. We have the same political, historical, financial, and legal backgrounds. The sovereign as well is another link. Soft power, fashion, film, arts, you know, we are linked over decades, and I think we need to build upon that relationship we have with each other. Nigerians are very much part of the British culture now. There's one thing about life, and it's permanent, and that is change. Britain is a multiracial, multicultural society, and that includes Nigerians. I think Brexit has changed a lot. I think there's more focus now on the Commonwealth. We've got the Commonwealth Games coming up in July in Birmingham. Also, at the end of April, the Nigerian government ministers and the UK government ministers signed a deal worth $300 million. Now, that will be direct investment into Nigeria. That alone will create 5,000 jobs. Now, you may say, so what? But it's the beginning of a process. That's the important thing. It's not just activity, it's action. It's not just words, it's real progress.
Now to our final topic. Nigeria's booming fintech sector has in recent weeks come under intense scrutiny due to allegations of financial and personal misconduct at Flutterwave, the country's $3 billion industry champion. Bosses at the group have dismissed the allegations, but the accusations have shone a light on the governance of these lucrative African startups. Number, which was recently known as Kudi, supports over 150,000 businesses on its platform, enabling these firms to carry out card, cash and bank transfer related transactions for their businesses and on behalf of their customers. Yinka Adewale, Number's CEO, joins me now from Lagos for more on this. Yinka Adewale, thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global today. Let me go straight into it. Why the name change?
Thanks for having me today. For us, I think over the last 5 years, we've built our brand around Kudi, the name Kudi, which means money, obviously. And I think the next phase for our business, as we expand the opportunities and the products that we're building for different segments, is actually focusing on helping small businesses grow. So the name Number actually comes from that point, which is a play on words, the word number itself. And what we're positioning to do is to help small businesses grow.
Okay, I think I read in Forbes yesterday that African startups attracted a record $5.2 billion in venture capital last year. I'm not sure how much a Number got off that money. But one thing I always struggle to ascertain is that you get the seed funding, that's good. But what about scalability and expansion of funding? Is that something that Number have been successful with, or do you find that a struggle that sometimes you get these Silicon Valley giants, they come in, pump money, but then run away and leave you to, you know, try and get the business up and running yourselves?
Yeah, good, very good perspective. So we've been around for a while now. So when we launched in 2017, for example, we had initially raised about $1.2 million in seed funding from Coastal Ventures in the US. But as you said, at that point, we're very early stage. I think we're probably best case processing $20,000 a year in payments. Now we've grown our business to over $6 billion a year in payments, right? And when you look at that globally, not even just in Nigeria, that positions you strategically as one of the biggest players in the space. So I think we've been able to, beyond just like raising seed funding, we've been able to actually build a business off the back of the investors we have and the products that we've built.
Yeah, I haven't been to business school yet, so I'm going to have to pick your brains because I want to know, how have you been able to do it? Because the fintech space in Nigeria, I don't want to say it's oversaturated, but it is very competitive. How has Nomba been able to stand out from the crowd?
So I think there's definitely that perspective that there's a lot of fintechs in Nigeria. The way I see it is there's a lot of opportunities. If you think about our GDP alone, right, we are about a 500 billion USD GDP a year. 50% of that comes from SMEs. And most of those SMEs actually do not have any form of digital payment solutions that they have. So I think that while there are a lot of opportunities that people have built in, like the consumer banking space, there's a lot of opportunities to actually provide point of sale payments for merchants. So for us, our unique proposition is actually a point of sale solution for merchants. We do think that helps them accept cards, transfers, and even record cash payments in their shops and stores, right? And we think off the back of that, we can then provide them other financial services like credit and access to working capital loans.
Yeah, I've got to tell you, Yinka, you are doing incredibly well, which is why you're probably receiving a phone call right now. Another firm that has been doing incredibly well is Flutterwave. And I've got to tell you, I was really disappointed a couple of weeks ago when I read that scandalous revelation. A lot of the allegations, some would say, are visible in most companies, but because I think Flutterwave have been put up on this pedestal as, the role model Nigerian fintech firm. But away from the scandal, because I know those allegations have been refuted, by the way, by Flutterwave. Some have said that, unfortunately, this could potentially cast a dark shadow over the thriving fintech sector in Nigeria. Do you share some of those concerns?
So I think like with our ecosystem, like many ecosystems in the world, we are a developing ecosystem. So obviously, there's a lot of things that can be done better by founders, teams, and even investors at large. But I think that when people also trust you with their money, especially their income, there's a level of accountability they hold you on to. What I think we would see, I do not necessarily think that there's going to be a lack of trust for our ecosystem. Maybe there's going to be a lot more due diligence that most investors in this space, especially like African investors, are kind of really thorough on that anyway. So I do think we will see a lot more diligence on companies, and which will definitely help companies actually run better, more efficiently.
Absolutely. Here. Governance is always growing and evolving and expanding, and it is a very, very new ecosystem which we must protect and nurture because we are proud of you guys. Thank you so much. Yinka Adewale, co-founder and CEO of Nomba. Thank you for joining me on Channels Business Global today, Yinka.
Thanks for having me.
Well, sadly, that's all we have time for today. But as always, do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I'll see you at the same time next week for more in-depth business analysis on Channels Business Global. Goodbye.